All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper, for taking out the time to talk to me today about you, your work, your philosophy about composition, and also your journey learning how to compose.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Great. And so, first of all, I want to ask if you can do a quick introduction of yourself and also your work.
Absolutely, yes. So I'm Will Cooper. My composer name is William David Cooper, my full name. I am a composer, but also a conductor and organist and teacher. And I'm based in Boston. I teach at the Walnut Hill School for the Arts.
Oh.
Um, I'm the head of theory and composition there. I'm also a music director at Wellesley Hills Congregational Church, and so that's a big part of my career as well as playing the organ, directing choir, and also writing a lot of music for church.
Mm.
Um, but as a composer, I did my undergraduate and master's degrees at Juilliard and a doctoral degree at UC Davis. And I write a lot of different kinds of music, but I'm particularly interested in opera and large-scale vocal works like cantatas and oratorios and things like that.
When I was listening to all your work on your website, a lot of them were choral work, so I was wondering whether you specialize in that, and it's interesting to know that you do.
Yeah, as you conduct choral groups, you learn a lot about the genre and the medium, and so I've written a lot of works for both amateur and professional choirs, and those require very different approaches.
Mm. And what would you describe your writing style in a sentence or a word?
That's really hard to do.
Of course, yeah.
The thing is, it's changing. I think right now it's changing. So I'll try to do it. It may be longer than a sentence, but um, I'm someone who's always been interested in and valued counterpoint and harmony and motivic development and form. And we were talking about Ross Bauer earlier. He's someone who really taught me about narrative as something that's distinct from form. Um, and I would say, like when I was at Juilliard, a lot of people compared my style to Second Viennese music, in particular Alban Berg, kind of the more lyrical, romantic side of the Second Viennese school. Um, in recent years, I've integrated some aspects of minimalism and like textural based composition into my style. And more recently than that, I've become very influenced by a filmmaker named David Lynch. I don't know if you've seen any of Lynch's films, but he's sort of a populist surrealist sort of director, and
Mm.
I'm not only inspired by his films, but also by the way he talks about his creative process, and the way that he frames that is you catch ideas and then you follow them where they take you, It's
Mm.
without fear of putting it into a box or a preconceived notion of what the art should be. You follow your idea. That's what I've been trying to do recently, and I think my music's been changing because of that.
Oh, great. And can you put that into context with a piece that you've written, perhaps?
Yeah, so I composed back in January a new cantata for Walnut Hill it's called When Peace Was Far Away. And I would say it's in four movements. The second movement is a good example of the style where I think I'm headed in. It's heavily indebted to certain of the Polish modernists, Władysławski and Penderecki,
Mm.
their kind of experimental aleatoric style. The other movements of the cantata are not really in that style. So
Mm.
I also think it's an interesting idea to juxtapose styles without necessarily, synthesizing them. That might
Mm.
be something I continue exploring.
Mm. Yeah. Another work that I found quite interesting was your Requiem.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you based it on texts, right? You based it on a text by Edgar Allan Poe, like part of the Bible. Like, can you tell me a
That's
bit
right.
about that?
Yeah. So traditionally requiems are settings of the Latin requiem, Mass for the Dead, right? I think it was Brahms was the first composer to abandon that model and actually select the texts themselves from the German translation of the Bible. Um, and then Herbert Howells, I think, took it even further and was more creative with his text selection and also was integrating both Latin and English texts for the Requiem. And then finally, you get Benjamin Britten in the War Requiem, who's using secular poetry in the and his, the War Requiem is about the horrors of war and how we can reconcile that with a belief in God. But my Requiem is actually I'm interested in exploring like antithetical views on a certain topic and trying to sort of hear them debating each other. So my Requiem is looking at death from a theistic perspective, from someone who believes in an afterlife and in God, and also from an atheistic perspective. What does death mean if there is no afterlife? And so the opening of the Requiem is Requiem Aeternam, the first part of the Requiem Mass. The second movement is a poem by Thomas Hardy, who is an atheist, and I think it's a very bleak but very thoughtful look at what death means if there's nothing after death. And basically what he says is that immortality is the remembrance of the dead person in their friends and family that slowly disintegrates to nothing over time. Very dark thought, right? And then the third movement is a psalm setting, which comes from that really dark place of death and like spiritual, just being totally lost and like crying out for help. And then the Pope poem that you mentioned is kind of like a childish, sort of an escapist view of death. And then finally, the last movement of the Requiem is a text from Revelation, and it's sort of a affirmation of a belief in afterlife and resurrection. So how that works.
And what inspired you to write this piece?
So I was commissioned by a church in New York City that's commissioned a lot of my sacred music, St. Peter's Lutheran Church. It's on 53rd and Lexington, so on the east side. They have a wonderful music program, and they do a requiem every All Saints Day, which a lot of churches do. So,
Yeah.
the Sunday after Halloween, basically. And I was commissioned to write this piece, and it was kind of the last big piece I wrote before the pandemic.
Mm, great. And that's very beautiful. And now I just want to talk a little bit about your composition process.
Huh.
So, where do you get the initial inspiration between your pieces and like what's your creative process? And we talked about this a little bit already, but can
Yeah.
you go into more detail?
Sure. So for me, there's a big difference if I have a text in the piece, if it's an opera or a cantata. For me, that's easy. I read the text and I immediately get ideas, like what the mood should be. I start hearing the vocal lines, how the rhythm of the poetry is going to lead to a musical line. With chamber music or orchestral music, it's very different because it's kind of abstract. And so I am very harmonically oriented. So I think I base a lot of my music on harmonic progressions. I improvise. Lately, especially, I've been doing a lot of improvisation to start out the process of composition. Uh, and I record it and I take things that I like and use those as my main ideas. And I revise a lot and change. And my initial idea is not always the beginning of the piece. It needs to be here and find another idea. So some composers, I think they get a idea of exactly how the whole piece is going to be, and then they fill in the details, right?
Yeah.
And for me, it's not like that. It's like the I have ideas, but I have no idea what order they should be in or where they're going to lead to.
Yes.
And so I kind of like that openness of it could go anywhere. And I'm not going to try to like have a preconceived idea of where it should go. I try to follow the ideas where they seem to want to go.
Mm. That's interesting. And you said earlier that your composition sort of changed from when you first started composing to now. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. When I was in school, I started my undergrad in 2004,
Hmm.
and this was sort of I see it as kind of like in a way there was still kind of this modernist uh, sort of flavor to a lot of the composers that were teaching there. I mean, I don't know if you know Milton Babbitt. Um,
Yes, yes, I do.
he was there, right? And I was
Hmm.
having journeys with him. And my teacher was Samuel Adler. Um,
Mm.
and so there was, it wasn't like studying in the 60s or 70s where everyone was writing 12-tone music,
Yeah.
but there was still a lot of leftover from that. And you've kind of felt like maybe that's how you should be writing, or
Mm.
at least you should learn that style. And so I got really into Schoenberg and Berg and Weber and wanted to write music like that and music like the American people that followed them, like Roger Sessions and Donald Martino and people like that. And so that's where I was headed. And at the same time, there were a lot of minimalists and so-called neo-romantic composers that were reacting strongly against modernism. And I felt like, you know, there were these two camps at Juilliard, and I was in the kind of the modernist or the you know, that what modernism led to, that camp.
Mm.
Um, and I think what I realized is I was a little too closed-minded. I needed to be open to minimalism and I also started using tonality and triads, um, in a very different way than how they've been used in the past. But
Mm.
um, that partly came out of the music I was writing for amateur choirs, church choirs, because you can't really write atonal music for an amateur church choir. I mean, you can, but they're not going to sing it, and they're not going to like you very much. So,
Mm.
um,
Right. Oh,
does it?
and was it writing for those amateur choirs that kind of made you open-minded, or was there like an event or anything, a concert or something you went through that kind of triggered that?
Yeah, so I think yeah, writing for amateur choirs and just realizing the practicalities of that was one thing. I was never very keen on the minimalist school of
Mm.
composition. In fact, I hated it when I was in school. Like, thought it was just awful, like lazy music. Um, and then maybe there were a couple pieces that maybe didn't quite change my mind, but made me more open to it. And one was seeing a performance of drumming by Steve Reich. And I remember
Mm.
it's like an hour-long piece, slowly unfolding process. And in the moment, I absolutely hated the piece. It felt like I was totally suffering. And the next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it,
Mm.
about what that experience was like, and about just like how my mind was altered by the meditative state that he created. And so that then I realized like that's actually really powerful.
Mm.
What he did. And then another thing was I think hearing a piece like San Francisco Polyphony by Ligeti,
Mhm.
which uses minimalistic techniques in a very different harmonic context. I
Mhm.
think one of the things that bothers me about minimalism is that it's usually diatonic. It's not very explorative from a harmonic
Mm.
perspective. Um,
Mm.
but the idea that you could use some of the techniques from minimalism, process and um, repetitive ostinatos in a more harmonically complex environment was something that I found fruitful.
Mm. That was very interesting. And is there like reference piece that we can listen to that shows that kind of transition?
Yeah. So there's a piece I wrote for Reed Quintet. Do you know what Reed Quintet is? It's kind of a modern alternative to woodwind quintet. So
Mm.
it's usually I think oboe, clarinet, bass clarinet, saxophone, and bassoon. I think that's what it is.
Interesting.
Um, and so I wrote a piece for Reed Quintet that is purely based on Ostinati, and gradually evolving Ostinati. It's called Ostinati, and I
Can you
think it's on.
explain what ostinati is real quick?
Yeah, of course. So ostinato comes from the Italian roots that we get the word obstinate from,
Mm,
which means like stubborn, like someone who won't like give in, like
yes.
uh, sticks to something. So an ostinato is like a stubborn musical idea that won't go away. So I mean, like this would be an example. Is it okay if I play something?
Yes, absolutely.
Something like this. Oops. So it's a musical idea that's Steve Reich.
Mm,
That repeats over and over and over again.
yeah,
And
yeah.
there could be variation, or there could be like a melody, on top of it or beneath it, but
Hmm.
it's like a repeating idea.
And that was
And
how you experimented with going from modernism to sort of with minimalism and stuff like that.
yes, but I wasn't using it diatonically like that. I was still
Mm.
using all 12 of the chromatic scale.
Oh,
Um,
I see.
and my changes, things were evolving more quickly than they would in a minimalist piece.
Mm. Can
And
you
so
see the
like,
name of the piece again?
yeah, ostinati.
Oh, it's called Ostinati.
Ostinati, yeah, it's named after the technique.
That's very catchy. Okay, I'll
Well,
go
I
listen
have
to it.
titles,
Mm,
my titles are not very imaginative, so sometimes I name them after the compositional technique that I'm using.
that's
Um,
nice.
I think it's on my SoundCloud page.
Okay, I'll go take a listen.
Yeah,
And I also want to ask sort of about your background learning composition and how you came to be a composer and how you came to, love contemporary, new modern music.
sure. So I grew up, uh, I loved music from a very early age. My mother is a violinist, amateur violinist, and so she would take me to her orchestra concerts, and so I got exposure to classical music in that way. I played the piano, and I think I started improvising at a very young age as well.
Mm.
But I would write music for these movies that my brothers and I would make, um, and then I got involved in radio theater, which is
Wow.
this really cool genre from like the early 19 the early 20th century, like radio dramas where
Mm,
you have people playing the characters with microphones, and you have a sound booth where people are making sounds of doors opening and footsteps and stuff, and then you have people playing, background music. And so I was composing music for that.
mhm.
Uh, and then I won a competition that was created by the Kalamazoo Symphony, in Southwest Michigan. And so I won that competition and had my music played by professional orchestra, and that was like the most magical thing that I'd ever experienced in my life. And still, I think hearing my music in a rehearsal or in a concert is feels like the most magical thing that I've ever experienced. It's like, I don't know, it's like a drug. It's exhilarating.
Yes, I bet.
So I went to Interlochen Arts Academy my senior year of high school, and that's where I really started studying composition formally.
Mhm.
Um, and then at Juilliard, studied with Samuel Adler for 5 years.
Mm.
And then I went to UC Davis for a PhD, and I studied with Ross and Kurt Rohde and Pablo Ortiz. I don't know if you know the other faculty. I think I saw that you were interviewing Sam Nichols.
Yes, I did.
So he's one of the faculty there as well.
Yes, yes, yes.
I didn't get to study with him, but it's a really fantastic
Mhm.
faculty, and I learned so many things there that I didn't learn at Juilliard, which
Oh.
was very helpful.
Mm. Uh, can you tell me like one thing that you learned there that you didn't learn at Juilliard?
Yeah, yeah. So I think I already mentioned that Ross was really focused on pacing
Hmm.
and rhythm. And I feel like at Juilliard I was really hyper focused on pitch and harmony.
Mm.
Um, that's one thing. And then Pablo Ortiz. um, encouraged me to think about composing differently. So he said, don't think about trying to write a masterpiece, like write the, don't think about writing like the best piece ever composed. Think about collecting sounds. Like this piece is going to be a collection of sounds, and then you're going to arrange them. And so I wrote a piece like that, and it felt really strange at first. But I think the result of that experiment led to, I think, one of my most successful pieces, which is an octet for Schubert octet. So it's clarinet, horn, bassoon, and string quintet.
Mm.
And it was very fortunate. One of the other nice things about UC Davis is that rather than at Juilliard where you're asking your friends to play, which is nice because your friends are amazing musicians, but they actually pay professional groups to come in and perform your music. That's
That's
kind of a difference between a conservatory, most conservatory programs, and then graduate university, public universities.
mm,
So a chamber group from the Berlin Philharmonic came and played, and that was quite amazing.
yes. Wow, that is quite interesting actually. You would think that Juilliard would have a very like high sort of like standard or like facility for like, premiering these works, but actually UC Davis is.
I think things have changed. I like to think that I don't know how it is these days, but when I was at Juilliard, there was actually a stipend. So players would get a little bit of money to play music by the composers. But if you think about it, that's maybe not such a great thing because it implies that if the students didn't get paid, they maybe wouldn't be interested in playing contemporary music. And so I don't know if it's still like this, but I think there still is kind of a hesitancy or an aversion to music written in the last 100 years or so.
I completely agree. And in your opinion, because this is exactly what I see as well and I want to target. So in your opinion, how can we overcome this obstacle? What are some things we can change or do that can help this?
It's a great question. I think it's something people have been struggling with for a long time,
Mhm.
but I think what you're doing is fantastic. Like just exposing, talking to composers and finding out what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing and trying to connect us to a wider audience. I think that's wonderful.
Mhm.
I think some people are taught certain attitudes to contemporary music by their teachers or by the culture, and they just need to be redirected to be kind of reset their attitude.
Mhm.
Um, and for some people, I think it takes being involved in,
Mm. No, for sure.
right?
Yeah.
If you're just an audience member and you're just passive receiving it, it's very different than actually feeling that you're a part of it.
Yes.
Then I think there needs to be just better education and more outreach,
Mhm.
um, finding audiences that don't usually come to concerts. So yeah, but it's definitely a huge issue, right? And I'm glad that you're addressing it, but I think we need more outreach. We need more education is the most
Definitely.
important. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you. And now I also kind of want to go back to your music and I
Yeah.
want to ask you, um, so are there new like techniques, directions, unexplored like areas that you want to try out in the future? What are you looking forward to trying?
Yeah. So I mentioned David Lynch and what an influence he's been on my thinking. So also there's a particular film of David Lynch's which is maybe his least accessible film, but one of my favorites, and it's called Inland Empire, and it's it's the story of a woman an actress who kind of gets trapped in the movie that she's making, and there comes a point where you can't tell what's real life and what's the film.
Mm.
And also at the same time, there's parallel story going on in Poland, like in the 1920s.
Oh wow.
And whenever the stories in Poland, you hear Lutoslawski and Penderecki music.
Yes.
This film got me back into like 60s and 70s modernism. Like
Mm.
it's really thorny, dissonant, textural kind of music.
Oh.
So I've really gotten into that, I think, lately. And um, there's another piece that I wrote, an orchestral piece that I wrote when I was at Aspen Music Festival in 2015. It's called Clouds of Witnesses, and it's for orchestra. And that piece, I think, I was trying to integrate that kind of atonal textural sort of style with something very tonal, and trying to put those two things together.
Mhm.
And I think that also manifested itself in an opera that I've been composing for the last 12 or 13 years, um, which I think kind of shows my stylistic evolution from my student years at Juilliard to now, because I've been working on it for all those years and I've been going back and revising it. Um, there's a scene where an angel suddenly appears to a character, and that it seemed like there needed to be it needed to be a totally different world, musical world, and that's where like tonality suddenly emerged, but a very different kind of tonality.
Mm.
So, but I'm open to however things are going to change, and I think every piece you have to be open to doing things that you never thought that you would do.
Mm. That's that's great. And is the piece that you've been working on going to be premiered or put online or anything like that?
Yeah, so you can find excerpts of that on my SoundCloud page. So the first act was premiered at the National Opera Association convention in 2016 at Indianapolis. And then there were scenes of it that were performed at Fort Worth Opera in Texas and West Edge Opera in Berkeley, California. And then there was a scene that was done at NEC a couple summers ago.
Oh wow.
But full premiere is going to happen. We're still figuring out the date, but in the next year or two in Indianapolis.
Oh wow, that's great. Well,
Yeah, I'm finishing up the orchestration of that right
oh
now.
nice. Okay, I hope I can hear it. Sounds
Yeah,
awesome.
sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's all the questions I have. Thank you so much for your insight.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great to meet you and keep doing what you're doing. And I hope to hear you perform sometime soon.
Thank you.